the very definition of tyranny. That's what James Madison called it when the same hands control legislative, executive, and judicial power. And this was no mere warning. It was a core principle at the very heart of the Constitution: separation of powers. Each branch has its role clearly defined in the Constitution. And when one takes power from another, think legislating from the bench, this is a serious violation of the Constitution. And the same principle applies in the other direction too. Like when Congress hands off its legislative power to the executive branch. This is not just bad policy. This is destroying the foundation of the Constitution and should never be tolerated because it puts us on the path to total tyranny. So on this episode, we're diving into the long-lost and long-ignored principle at the heart of the Constitution, the non-delegation doctrine. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, April 7th, 2025. And for this, of course, we got to start out with the text of the Constitution. Here we are, right at the top. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. All legislative powers herein granted, not some, not most, not shareable, all of them. And then notice on top of it, it doesn't say the legislative power because this is a document of very limited delegated powers. So only those legislative powers herein granted. That wording matters because, as James Madison explained in Federalist Number 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And the principle that power delegated is both limited and on top of it non-transferable was a fundamental principle at the founding. Nick Szabo explained it like this. Two maxims of law current at the founding were, well, I'm not going to read the Latin phrases because I just never get it right, were a delegated authority cannot be again delegated, and a delegate or deputy cannot appoint another. So if you delegate a power to somebody, they can't just say, I'm going to re-delegate this to somebody else. I mean, unless you give them approval. And then if you delegate someone to do a job, they just can't appoint somebody else to do that job for them. And these were not fringe ideas at the founding. They were part of the legal and constitutional tradition, the foundation that the founders inherited going back, well, we could say maybe centuries. Now, some people point to Sir Edward Coke, they call him Sir Edward Coke a lot of times, who was actually citing people way before him, going all the way back to Roman law. But I think John Locke summed it up best here from his two treatises. The legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. For it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. So this is a principle of agents or servants and principals. The people are the principal authority. They are the source of all power, and government is merely their agent. So if you delegate a power to an agent, they can't just redelegate it somewhere else. Next up from there is John Locke's foundation. Again, government is an agent of the people and not a master. He said the people alone can appoint the form of the Commonwealth, which is by constituting the legislative and appointing in whose hands that shall be. Well, how do you figure that out under the Constitution? Well, it's in the Constitution itself. Locke continued. He said, and when the people have said, we will submit to rules and be governed by laws made by such men and in such forms, nobody else can say other men shall make laws for them, nor can the people be bound by any laws, but such as are enacted by those whom they have chosen and authorized to make laws for them. So soon as Congress redelegates their legislative power to somebody else, or if the judicial branch takes it from Congress, the people are not bound to obey it because it wasn't done properly as the people of the several states determined through their constitution. And St. George Tucker explained this same principle again at the very heart of the Constitution. He said, it being one of not just the Constitution for these United States, but this was a foundational principle of all the constitutions at the founding. He said, it being one of the great fundamental principles of the American governments, that the people are the sovereign. Sovereignty means final authority. The founding generation, the old revolutionaries, of course, they fought a long, bloody war to secede from a system where the king in parliament held sovereignty. In other words, it could, in essence, do no wrong. Anyways, this is a great fundamental principle of the American governments, that the people are the sovereign, and those who administer the government, their agents and servants, not their kings and masters. That's St. George Tucker in his great view of the Constitution of the United States. But let's go back to John Locke, again, his two treatises. This wasn't a warning. It was really a command limit. If you weren't chosen to make law, you have no right to do it. He said the power of the legislative, being derived from the people by a positive, voluntary grant and institution, can be no other than what that positive grant conveyed, which being only to make laws and not to make legislators, the legislative can have no power to transfer their authority of making laws and place it in other hands. And we see a very similar principle explained by James Wilson, one of the leading framers in the Philadelphia Convention, of course, one of the top legal minds of the founding generation. He was one of the first associate justices on the first Supreme Court, nominated for that role by President George Washington, and he considered this principle as essential to the system under the Constitution. He said, congressional authority is to be collected not from tacit implication, but from the positive grant expressed in the instrument of the Union. And John Locke thought this was so essential a principle that he listed it among 4 essential rules, fundamental rules that apply to every form of government, everywhere, for all legislatures. He said the legislative neither must nor can transfer the power of making laws to anybody else or place it anywhere but where the people have. Luke Wake, in his paper, Taking the Non-Delegation Doctrine Seriously, I think summed up these principles we've covered so far better than anyone. He put it like this: therefore, as the agent of the people, the legislature cannot subdelegate its entrusted powers to anyone else without violating the trust that the people have conferred in the legislative assemblage. And no one explained why this was done. What was the reason you kept these powers separate, better than the celebrated Montesquieu and his great The Spirit of the Laws, which all the founding generation read widely all over the place. And here's how he put it. Let me pull this up. He said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. And I don't think I can emphasize this enough. Montesquieu didn't say that liberty was going to be at risk, or this was dangerous, or you're going to lose some liberty, or a lot, or most of it. But when legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. And it may not happen today, or tomorrow, or next year, but over time, eventually, there will be zero liberty left. And why? Because apprehensions may arise, he wrote, lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. It's almost like Judge Dredd, I guess. But everyone at the founding, the time of the Constitution and the ratification debates, both Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike, they all cited Montesquieu. Even though they read him a little bit differently, everybody looked to Montesquieu as being on their side, and they all agreed with the principle behind that. And I covered Montesquieu and the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in much more detail in an episode just last December, Anti-Federalist versus Federalist Clash, Montesquieu and Separation of Powers. That'll be linked to in the show notes. Alan Mosley will get a blog post organized for this episode with all the links and reference notes that I'm mentioning, generally in the order that I'm going through the episode, and I'll get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple of hours after this live stream is done. But let's get back to it. In the first Congress, Representative James Madison, we know, proposed a bunch of amendments that eventually turned out to be the Bill of Rights. But he also included in his amendment proposals in June of 1789 a kind of a 1-2 punch. He wanted a brand new Article 7 in the body of the Constitution that would have expressly included separation of powers and a precursor to the 10th Amendment. And here's what he proposed. Eighthly, that immediately after the Article 6th be inserted as Article 7th, the clauses following, to wit, the powers delegated by this Constitution are appropriated to the departments to which they are respectively distributed, so that the legislative department shall never exercise the powers vested in the executive or judicial, nor the executive exercise the powers vested in the legislative or judicial, nor the judicial exercise the powers vested in the legislative or executive departments. And the next clause, the powers not delegated by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. Now, if we understand the context of what Representative James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, was doing here, he understood that the Constitution was very close to losing the ratification debates. It almost lost, and it was only turned around once John Hancock and Samuel Adams up in Massachusetts agreed to a deal where they were going to approve. It was going to fail in Massachusetts, which means it was probably going to fail in New York State and in Virginia, and it was done. And so Hancock and Adams made a deal that said, okay, we will make basically a gentleman's deal, and we will agree to do this as long as you guarantee to us that you're going to give us some amendments later on, because we're okay with making changes. We just don't want it to be poorly defined. And some of the concerns they had issues with, the first thing in Massachusetts, for example, was they proposed, Hancock and Adams, working with some people on the other side, they proposed a recommended amendment that became the 10th Amendment. But separation of powers was a big issue amongst the other states as well, who were proposing recommended amendments. So Madison didn't even really want to have a Bill of Rights. He argued against it along with all the other Federalists, but he understood kind of the political need for this. And I think part of what was going on here, and maybe we'll see a little bit more in just a moment, was that Madison was proposing stuff to make sure that the opponents, here it is, in the first few months after the first Congress started meeting in 1789, I think he was trying to kind of diffuse tensions a little bit, even though he wasn't thinking that these were needed, because he, like everyone else on the Federalist side, didn't think the 10th Amendment was needed because the system was set up so that all powers not delegated were reserved. But the Anti-Federalists said, well, we had it spelled out like that in the Articles of Confederation. The fact that you're taking it out of there makes us very concerned. So Madison understood that and included that as a recommended amendment. And same with the notion of separation of powers. But in those debates, after Madison proposed this, we get here from Elon Werman in his non-delegation at the founding paper. He points out, he went through a little bit of history on this, that Representative Roger Sherman objected to Madison's proposal, especially on separation of powers. He conceived the amendment, quote, to be altogether unnecessary, inasmuch as the Constitution assigned the business of each branch of the government to a separate department. So people like Sherman, one of the leading founders, of course, real old school guy. He's like, what's the point of this? This is totally unnecessary because we've already spelled out what each department can do. And nothing in there says that each department can kind of pass the buck. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows them to transfer powers. And there's nothing in there that says that they can do anything remotely like that. And Madison, Werman points out, Madison agreed with Roger Sherman. It actually is unnecessary. But, and if you think of the context of what Madison was doing in proposing amendments there in 1789, he supposed the people would be gratified with the amendment, as it was admitted that the powers ought to be separate and distinct. It might also tend to an explanation of some doubts that might arise respecting the construction of the Constitution. So he was basically, with this proposed amendment, this new Article 7, the 10th Amendment and separation of powers, this was really a tip of the hat to his opponents. I think it's very honorable that that's what he was trying to do. He didn't even think it was needed, but he was doing it to lessen the fear and the concern of the opponents of the Constitution right out of the gate. Now, you might be wondering, with all this that we're talking about, what the hell happened? How did we get from there to where we are today? And you probably will not be surprised that it has its roots really not fully rooted in the New Deal, but that's where things really exploded. Here from 2020, Mike Rappaport at the Originalism Center blog, he said it was 85 years ago, so now 90 years ago, that the Supreme Court used the non-delegation doctrine to strike down important delegations of legislative power in a few cases during the New Deal. And that was the end of it. But the doctrine, he wrote, fell prey to the New Deal judicial revolution. With the appointment of New Deal justices, the Supreme Court started to apply the doctrine extremely leniently to allow enormous delegations of policy-making discretion to the executive. And in essence, the executive is where almost all the laws are written these days, but it's now considered just policy-making or regulation writing. And it has nothing to do with Congress. Congress just writes a bunch of open-ended stuff, and then the executive branch just puts it all together however they want it. And he said, since the New Deal, and this is really important, since the New Deal, no delegations reviewed by the Supreme Court, and there have been many, none have been struck down as unconstitutional. So here we are, 90 years, and not a single Supreme Court opinion has struck down a single act of Congress unconstitutionally delegating its legislative power to the executive branch. Not once. I reserve my right to be wrong on this because it's been 5 years since Mike wrote this blog post, but I do not think, I know there was one in 2022 where they said something was unconstitutional under the major questions doctrine, which is different than this. They did not say it was unconstitutional because it was unconstitutionally delegated. That is a serious, serious problem. And Aaron Gordon, in his awesome paper, Non-Delegation, points out how bad the results have been, using some numbers to explain how it's all played out. Of course, he starts out noting that the first operative sentence of the Constitution provides, just like we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. However, today, he writes, the foremost source of rules governing private conduct at the federal level is not Congress, but rather administrative agencies. That's the executive branch. So the executive branch is writing rules that have the force of law, and Congress is just writing some open-ended stuff saying, well, the executive branch will figure it out and write the law. And that's how it's played out. And here's some numbers from Aaron Gordon's paper. Between 1976 and 2015, I guess what's that, 40 years about? I don't know. I went to government-run school, so I'm struggling with math. The number of pages of statutory law enacted annually grew from just over 4,000 to about 6,200. So pages of statutes passed by Congress went up about, what is that, 50%? I don't know. Again, my math is terrible. 4,000 to 6,200. while pages of administrative regulation, that's the executive branch, soared, it almost doubled from 12,600 to nearly 24,700. The U.S. Code, he writes, currently stands at about 22 million words, while the Code of Federal Regulations is almost 5x, 103 million. So we can see that just over that 40-year period, of course, opened up by the Constitution-hating Supreme Court back in the New Deal. That hasn't changed much these days, but it's really created a growth of power. Congress has run with it. The executive from both sides, doesn't matter. They have run with it, accepted that power, and used it like crazy. And Aaron says the U.S. Code is replete with provisions authorizing agencies to issue regulations carrying the force of federal law. This is legislating from the Oval Office or legislating from the White House or from an agency, a fact about which the federal judiciary seems largely unconcerned. And George Washington, in his great farewell address in 1796, first drafted by James Madison in 1792 when he was going to step down after one term, but after he was convinced to stay in 1796, he asked Hamilton to revise it a bit. It was all under Washington's direction. He warned about this spirit of encroachment, this tendency for one branch or another to try to gain more power at the expense of the others. And he said this leads to a system of total tyranny. He said it is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon the other. The spirit of encroachment, he wrote, tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. So unfortunately for all of us today who want to see the Constitution followed, who want to see an advancement of liberty, more prosperity, most people these days who correctly and vehemently oppose things like legislating from the bench seem to have no problem when Congress passes the buck and allows legislation from the Oval Office, especially when it comes to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution, the Declare War Clause. And on the other side, they're just as bad, and sometimes they're even far worse. They're suddenly worried about all kinds of executive power, but they've spent decades upon decades cheering on the courts when they basically legislate from the bench. And unless all the people on all sides really start wising up and rejecting all of this stuff all the time, no matter who does it and when, we'll get just what James Madison and George Washington warned us about, a total tyranny. Now, I don't know about you. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones, but I never learned a lick of this stuff in government-run, government-approved schools. I went to private school for a while. I went to government-run school for a while. Never got any of it, not even once. And that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles at the very heart of the Constitution, from the founders, the old revolutionaries, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when the government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. And if you want to help us do this work, nothing helps us more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you don't want to become a member, that's totally cool. Or if you already are one, that's even more cool, and you want to help us out with a one-time contribution or pitch in a little bit extra, I'd be very grateful for any consideration you give to doing that today. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'm not going to belabor that point there, but I really appreciate any consideration you give to putting your financial faith behind the 10th Amendment Center today. There are also a number of free and easy peasy things you can do to help us spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the mainstream platforms. One of the most prominent things you can do is have a lot of watch time percentage on video platforms like YouTube. So if you're watching 80% of the video, that's great. Hopefully you want to watch all of it and get here to the end. But at 100%, that tells the algorithm even more. 120, 150, 200%. The more that you watch it, the more likely they'll show us to more people. Also, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, hitting the like button, subscribing, getting notification, comments, wherever you can leave comments. All that stuff really helps out a great deal. I'm very grateful for that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope it was at least a little bit interesting, because this is some pretty deep stuff, and hopefully I did my best, and hopefully it was at least enjoyable to watch or listen to. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.